All right, our goal for these second set of notes is to factor using a greatest common factor. So we call that a GCF. So a GCF is the greatest common factor. Okay, so what we need to do first is we have to look at all three terms. What are the factors of 4? What are the factors of 2? And what are the factors of 6? So let's actually go off to the side real quick and let's just talk about how to come up with factors. If I'm talking about the number of 12, we have factors. We have 1 times 12 gets us 12, 2 times 6 gets us 12, 3 times 4 gets us 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12 are all factors of 12. So if I was looking at 12, and let's say I was looking at the number 24, and I went through and said, okay, so what are the factors of 24? I have 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. So my factors of 24 are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12, and 24. So the greatest common factor then what would the greatest common factor, so what is a number that shows up in both lists and is the largest one? So 2 shows up in both of them, but that's not the largest number that shows up in both. There's 3 that shows up in both, but that's not the largest. 4 shows up in both, 6 shows up in both, and 12 shows up in both. But 12 is the largest number that shows up in both, so 12 is your greatest common factor. That's what we're doing here, okay? So we need to find a greatest common factor. Now, all this work that we just wrote out, that's not necessary every single time. You're looking at the numbers 4, 2, and 6 here. What is the greatest common factor between 4, 2, and 6? And remember, 2 only has the factors of 1 and 2. So if it would have to be 1 or 2, and it has to work for all three numbers, for 4, 2, and 6, and which one's the biggest one? And it's 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to write 2 on the outside, and we have to think about what would be left. Okay. Before we even get to this step, though, let's try to rewrite each of these terms with 2 times something. So 2 times what would give us 4x squared? 2x squared. 2 times 2x squared gives us 4x squared. Plus 2 times just x, plus 2 times what would give you 6? And it's 3. So you can write out this step if this helps you. And then your greatest common factor then is 2. So what we do is we factor that out front. It's just like what we did with the distributing. It's like undistributing. So you pull the 2 out front, and what you're left with then is 2x squared plus x plus 3. We pulled the 2 out, and what we have left was the 2x squared, the x, and the 3. The 2x squared, the x, and the 3. Okay, so what we have here is this original answer and this factored answer are the exact same value. I didn't change the value at all. I just changed how it was written. Okay, so let's try it with this next one. What is the biggest number that goes into 3, 9, and 12, or negative 12? And it doesn't matter if you think about it as a positive or negative. What would our GCF, our greatest common factor between 3, 9, and 12 be? The biggest number that goes into all three of those numbers. And that answer is 3. So we're going to have a 3 out front in our answer. Okay? Now, 3 times what would give you x squared, or 3x squared? And it would 3 times x squared. Plus 3 times what gives you 9x? 3x. 3 times 3x gives us 9x. If I were to be distributing this, okay, 3 times what will give us negative 12? And that would be negative 4. Okay. Now, do you have to write this step right here that we wrote last time? No, not necessarily, but if it helps you, you're more than welcome to write that step in. So if I were to write that step in, I have 3 times x squared plus 3 times 3x minus 3 times 4. Or you could write this as plus 3 times negative 4. It doesn't matter. Okay? But anyways, that's what you're going to get when you write it out in those steps. And then you can factor out that 3 that shows up every time. And what you're left with is x squared plus 3x minus 4. Which is exactly what we got there in the end. All right, so let's try this next one. How about you guys try this next one? Try to come up with the GCF on your own. So what would the greatest common factor here be between 8 and 12? So go ahead and right now try to figure out that greatest common factor between 8 and 12. And what'd you guys come up with? I think 4 would be the greatest common factor between 8 and 12. 4 goes into both of these numbers, and I don't think there's anything larger than that goes into both of them. Okay. If you need to write out the list like we did over here, just do it on a scrap piece of paper or off to the side. That's totally okay. Okay. So I know that I'm going to have a 4 out front. 4 times what gives you 8x? 4 times 2x gives you 8x. Yeah, that plus sign still. 4 times what will give you 12? 4 times 3. So we have 4 times 2x plus 3, or times the quantity of 2x plus 3. And let me fix where that parenthesis is because I didn't need them that wide. So that would be your factored form there. Okay, try number 4 on your own. So click pause on the video and try this one on your own. And then when you hit play, you'll be able to see what the answer is. All right, so what you should have gotten was the greatest common factor was 5. So you have 5 on the outside times x squared plus 5. All right, so starting with number 5, things change just a little bit because we don't just have a greatest common factor that is a number. We actually are going to have an expression. So our greatest common factor here is going to be the greatest common factor between 2 and 8. So the greatest common factor there is 2. But then I also noticed that I have an x squared in this one and an x in this one. The greatest common factor there is going to be x. So I'm going to write out that middle step that we had talked about and this one just because sometimes it gets tricky. So if I have 2x times what would give you 2x squared? I'd have to multiply by x again. So that would be the same as 2x squared. Plus 2x times what would give us 8x? Times 4. So then my greatest common factor is that 2x. So we pull that out front, and what are we left with once that 2x comes out front? We're left with the x plus 4. So that would be how we would factor the greatest common factor here. Now you guys did this back in Algebra 1, but it's been a while. So that's why we're going over it again. All right. So for number 6, our greatest common factor, we have a 1, and a 3. So the biggest number that we could pull out would be a 1. But we have some variables to pull out here. So the variable that we're going to pull out would be just 1x. We have 3 x's, 2 x's, and 1x. So the biggest one we can pull out is just the singular x. Okay. So when I pull out that x, I'm going to have x times what would give me x to the third? It would have to be x squared. Plus x times x would give me x squared. Plus x times what would give me 3x? 3. And that would be your final answer. Again, if you want to write out that middle step, you are more than welcome to do so every time, but I don't tend to write it out, but if it helps you, then go for it every time. All right, so let's look at this next one. So the greatest common factor between 3 and 12 would be 3. What is the greatest common factor between x cubed and x squared? It would be x squared. So again, if you want to write out that excuse me, that middle step, we can do that. So we have 3x squared times what would give us 3x cubed? We'd have to multiply by x again. Plus 3x squared times what would give us 12x squared? There has to be a 4, and I don't need any x's with that because I already have x squared. So then my greatest common factor was 3x squared. So I pull that out front. And what I'm left with is x plus 4. And so that right there is my final answer. And that is factored form. And then this last one, which I'm actually going to add one more because there's one more I want you guys to see. Let's look for the GCF on this one. So the GCF over here, what is the greatest common factor between 12, 3, and 9? 3. And then look at the variables. What's the greatest common factor between x squared, x, and no variables? And it would just have to remain that 3. So we don't have any variables there because we don't have any x's to pull out of that last one. So I have a 3 out front. And 3 times what number would give you 12x squared? I didn't pull any x's out, so I know it's something x squared. 3 times what number gives you 12 would be 4. A minus sign. 3 times what gives you 3x? 1x. So I don't have to write the 1 there. Plus 3 times what gets you 9? 3. And that will be your answer. All right, there is one more that I want to go over with you because it has to do if we have a placeholder, and you'll see what I mean. So if we have, we'll do example 9 on here. So if I have 15x squared minus 9x plus 3, what would the GCF of this be? So that's not the hard part. Go ahead and try to figure that out on your own. All right, what did you guys get for the greatest common factor between 15x squared, 9x, and 3? And you should have gotten 3. So what happens very often is that people will put the 3 on the outside, and they'll say, okay, well, 3 times 5x squared would give me my 15x squared. Yep, that looks good. Minus 3 times 3x will give me 9x. And then they leave this last term blank. But if you started with 3 terms, you still have to have 3 terms. 3 times what will give you 3? You have to have a 1, because if you change it to a 0, 3 times 0 does not get you 3. You have to make sure that you leave it as a placeholder there as a 1, because 3 times 1 is how you would get 3. Okay, so that would be your final answer. And that's going to be our last example, and then you guys can get started on your assignment.